Hi, Mr. Richards here. Today's lesson is on percent of change. And the first thing we want to figure out is, well, what is percent of change? We can define percent of change as a ratio that compares the change in quantity to the original amount. So we can write this as percent of change is equal to our amount of change over the original amount. Now we can have two types of percents of change, an increase and a decrease. And this is pretty logical. A percent of increase is when your percent is positive, and a percent of decrease is when your percent is negative. So our key concept, percent of change, is our amount of change over our original amount. In example 1, find the percent of change from 20 students to 24 students. State whether the percent of change is an increase or decrease. Well, if we break this down into some simple steps to follow, step 1 would be to find the amount of change. Now, to do this, it's going to be our final amount minus our original amount. So we went from 20 to 24. So our final amount here is 24 minus our original amount, which was 20. So our amount of change is equal to 4. Now our second step, step 2, is going to be actually to find percent of change. Now remember, percent of change can be found by looking at the ratio of our amount of change divided by our original amount. And so, percent of change here is going to equal that amount of change, which was a positive 4, over the original amount, which was 20. When I do 4 divided by 20, that's 0.2, or 2/10. Step 3 now is going to be to get this into a percent and ask ourselves increase or decrease. Our 2/10 as a percent, we're going to move the decimal over twice and identify this as 20%. Well, since this is a positive amount, this is going to be a 20% increase. And that's our answer, a 20% increase. So to find the percent of change, we're going to take our amount of change, which we broke down here to get 4, divided by our original amount, which is 20, take our 0.2 or 2/10 into a percentage, and since it was a positive percent, it's a 20% increase. In our second example, Pedro had 325 trading cards. He now has 270 trading cards. Find the percent of change, round to the nearest tenth if necessary, and state whether the percent of change is an increase or decrease. All right, well, percent of change is equal to our amount of change divided by our original amount. And so, it is important to know that for this amount of change, we're looking at the final amount minus the original. In the previous example, we showed this step by step, but now we can start to kind of combine some of these things. So final minus original. Well, he had 325 cards. He now has 270 cards. So if we're looking at final minus original, he now has 270. So that's our final, 270, minus our original of 325. And that's all going to be divided by 325. Now 270 minus 325 is negative 55 over 325. And when I divide that, we end up with a negative, we'll write 0.1692. Now let's get this into a percentage before we round. And so we're going to move this decimal place over twice to the right. And so this is going to equal a negative 16.92%. And I look to round to the nearest tenth of a percent. I'll look at my 9, which is in the tenths place. Looked one spot to the right at the 2. It's not going to round it up. So we're going to record our answer as negative 16.9%. And when asked to identify this as a increase or decrease, well, it's negative, so it's going to be a decrease. Our second key concept in this lesson is how do I calculate percent error? Let's figure out what percent error is. We're going to define this as a measure of the difference between an estimate prediction or measurement and the actual value. And the formula we're going to use for this is that percent error is going to equal our amount of error divided by our actual value, and we're going to multiply this by 100 at the end. So in our last example of this lesson, example 3, Ben estimated that he would make $90 at his weekend job. He actually earned 80. What was the percent error of his estimate? Well, our formula is percent error is equal to that amount of error divided by the actual value, and we'll multiply by 100 at the end. Well, we need to figure out what our amount of error is. Well, our amount of error, he thought he would make $90. He actually earned 80. So the amount of error here is 90 minus 80, and we'll divide that by the actual value. He actually earned 80. And again, we'll multiply by 100 at the end. So now, 90 minus 80 is 10, divided by 80, and multiplying by that 100. 10 divided by 80 is our decimal, 0.125 or 125 thousandths, times 100. And what that multiplying by 100 is basically going to do is get this decimal into a percent. And when I multiply by 100, I move that decimal twice to the right to get my final answer here of 12 5/10% error. And that is it for this lesson on percent of change. Good luck.